Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here on this beautiful spring day. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Parker Lee Distinguished Lecture on World War II and its Aftermath. This event is made possible by the generous support of Parker and Barbara Lee, who conceived of and sponsor this lecture series. And we want to thank you for your vision and commitment to the idea that we must study the history of World War II in order to understand the shape of our contemporary world. Thank you, Parker. It is also particularly wonderful to be hosting this lecture today in the Edgar Shannon Library just after its grand opening. Partnering with the library in co-hosting this event has been a pleasure for us, and this beautifully renovated building enters its new era at the center of intellectual life at the University of Virginia. So thank you to all our friends at the library. We're also grateful to our colleague Manuela Ichilis for the support of UVA's Center for German Studies and the European Studies program. And a huge thanks to Annalise Lucas of the College Foundation for her central role in crafting and organizing this event, as well as our Karsh Institute staff, particularly Vivian Feggins, for her events planning. I can think of few scholars working today who are better positioned to help us understand the influence of World War II than Serhii Plokhy. He comes to us from Harvard University, and he spent a very long time getting here from there yesterday, about 24 hours because of the snowstorms, although our weather has apparently compensated for that. So a huge thanks for the struggle to get here. He arrived late last night, but we're grateful that you've made it. Serhii is the Mikhailo Hureshky, I was promising I would get this right, but Hureshevsky Professor of Ukrainian History. And the chair actually honors a man who's considered the founder of modern Ukrainian historiography. Plokhy has built on his work throughout his career. He is also the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, leading the most important center on the U.S. devoted to the study of Ukraine. Plokhy's first book, The Cossacks and Religion in Early Modern Ukraine, was published by Oxford University Press in 2001 and explores the emergence of the Cossacks as a group in the 16th and 17th century and the role of the Orthodox Church in that process. Since then, he has written an extraordinary series of works that have reshaped our understanding of the 20th century of Ukraine and Russia. His 2011 book, Yalta, The Price of Peace, published by Viking Press, used newly declassified Soviet documents to provide a groundbreaking analysis of the fateful impact of the negotiations between Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill at Yalta in 1945. His 2014 book, The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, won the Lena Gelber Prize for the Best English Language Book on International Relations. And he publishes a lot and quickly and beautifully. His 2015, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, which came out with basic books, won the Taras Shevchenko National Prize in Ukraine. I joked earlier, this is my Slavic test, basically. Anyway, Plokhy has also been a vital voice in the past years in helping us understand the historical roots for the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. I highly recommend his powerful December 2023 piece for the Wall Street Journal, The War That Neither Ukraine Nor the West Can Afford to Lose, and his most recent book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, which we have available for purchase here, is a searing and vital account that is a must-read for those seeking to understand the current conflict and its fundamental importance for the future of democracy in Europe and around the globe. So we're deeply grateful as well for the way you have helped us to illuminate the history and contemporary struggles of your country. Today, Serhii is going to speak about another of his books, his 2019, The Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, taking us deep into a fascinating and critical moment in the history of World War II. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes, presenting on the book, and then our UVA colleague from the history department, Kirill Kunakovich, will lead a conversation with him exploring the implications of his research and arguments and the implications for the present day for about 15 minutes. We're really lucky to have you with us, Kirill, today. He's a leading historian of the Cold War. His 2022 book, Communism's Public Sphere, Culture as Politics in Cold War and in Poland and Germany, tells the powerful story of how cultural spaces in communist regimes that suppressed free speech became sites of contestation and political imagination and created an alternative public sphere. Kirill teaches a range of courses on the Cold War and Russian history, and we had the pleasure last night of meeting some of his wonderful students. Kirill, thank you for being with us for the conversation. So after that conversation, we'll then open it up for questions from the audience. We will have a microphone that will be brought around, so if you can raise your hand, we'll bring the microphone because this event is being recorded so that it can be made available on our YouTube channel for those who couldn't make it today. and we hope that you'll have lots of questions. Afterwards, there'll be a book signing. We have several of the books available for purchase, and you'll be able to talk to the speaker. So, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn over the floor. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, especially compare what Boston area and Northeast came through in the last few days. This is the presentation that is based on my book project. The title is Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front. And when I was working on the project, I didn't think that it would be as relevant as it turned out to be in the context of the latest war that is happening in the region. I call it the Russo-Ukrainian War. There are different names for that war as well. And this is the largest war in Europe since World War II. And it was very much, and we know that the war about democracy, at least on the one side, on the side of the Western allies. But the ally of the West in that war was anything but a democratic. That was the Soviet Union, which adds complexity to the war on a level that probably doesn't exist for the current war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, where it is very, very clear where the democratic side of the world is, on whose side they are. The Ukrainian democracy, it's very clear and manifested itself in the last few decades since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and Russia that is growing increasingly not just more authoritarian, but almost dictatorial. So the democracy is also a big story of this war, as it was the big story of World War II. And that is what I'm going to talk about today. The focus is the grand alliance that existed during the Second World War between the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and that's the term that was coined by Winston Churchill. And when the war ended, the expectation was that really that grand alliance and the peace that was formed as the result of the victory of the alliance in the war, that it would last almost forever. There was no probably rhetoric of the World War II becoming the war that would end all wars, as was the case with World War I, but there was certainly that sort of expectations. Now, looking back at the events of the last years of the war, and also the first post-war developments, we realize that those expectations were probably naive. Alliances generally don't survive the wars in which they are formed, and if the Grand Alliance would survive, probably that would be not a norm, but that would be an exception. Nevertheless, because, and partial for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons, because the expectations were so high, people were looking back at the moments of the end of World War II and then a few years later, the start of the Cold War, asking the questions of who was responsible for that, how we can explain that. And there is a long history. There is a long history of the origins of the Cold War, different approaches from pointing fingers at one side to another, to talking about structural changes in the world as the result of quote-unquote implosion of the British Empire and the creation of bipolar world with Washington and Moscow there. And it's all good literature. What I'm going to do today, and what I was also trying to do in the book, is just going beyond these three gentlemen, going beyond geopolitics, and trying to understand what was happening on the ground at the end of the World War II and at the start of the Cold War, focusing on one place and on a number of individuals on the American side and on the Soviet side. And the argument that I'm trying to make is that the issues of political culture and democracy in particular were an important contributing factor in the fall of the Grand Alliance and the rise of the Cold War tensions. Because the people that I follow, with whom I start as being exceptionally optimistic about the alliance, go then really sour about it, and on the American side and on the Soviet side, becoming the first Cold Warriors. So I'm following a number of people, and I'm looking at what happened to them. The place that I'm looking at happened to be in the middle of also today's battle between Russia and Ukraine and the democratic world, and the war waged and supported by a number of authoritarian regimes. The place is Ukraine. The 3 air bases were American air bases, were established in today's Ukraine in Poltava region. One was in Poltava, and 2 additional bases in the areas around Poltava in 1944, in the spring of 1944. There was initiative came from the United States of America. There was a strategic, very important component in that entire story. They were putting together the system of shuttle bombing of the areas in Eastern Germany and Eastern Europe. Because of the technological issues with the planes, there was not enough fighter planes that would protect the flying fortresses, B-17 planes. One of them is here on the way to Eastern Europe. So the idea was that the planes would take off from the airfields in Italy and in Britain, bomb the targets in Eastern Europe, German targets in Eastern Europe, land in Ukraine, in Poltava or near Poltava, would refuel, get new ammunition, and go back, and would also bomb targets on the way back. The history was of the Poltava basis was not unknown. I was not the first who discovered it, and there was a number of books written on it. All of them were written from the American point of view, which is less important, but more important, all of that were based on the American military archives and partially memoirs as well. So what I'm trying to do here is what I tried to do also in my Yalta book, to bring in the Soviet materials and to see whether that changes the story, whether that changes picture or not. And this time I got really lucky. I got over 40 volumes of the materials of the surveillance of the Americans and the Soviets, and also the Ukrainians who were in contact with Ukrainians. And the materials came from the Soviet counterintelligence called SMERSH, and also the commissariat of the state security that was dealing not so much with the Americans, but with the Ukrainians and with the Soviets who came in contact with the Americans. So what you see here is the document with the photo of Colonel Hampton, one of the commanders of the Poltava military base, signed by the head of the local Red Army counterintelligence unit. His last name was Zorin, and I was able to track him all the way into Washington into the 1950s, when he was actually stationed here and was trying to establish also contacts with the former American officers who were at Poltava. So it is World War II story with the continuation into the Cold War. Now, the initiative came from the United States of America, and the decisions were made at the highest level, with Stalin personally involved, Roosevelt reminding Stalin about the request that was made by the American Air Force, and eventually gradually agreeing to open those bases. Why it was so difficult for the Soviets to say yes? This is one of the questions that I am asking. Well, the bases that were opened in May of 1944, really Stalin wanted them out already by the summer of 1944. Because one of the considerations to say yes to Roosevelt was that he wanted the U.S. and Britain to open the second front. Once the second front was open, there was no any more interest to accommodate the American requests. The Soviets also didn't realize or considered that to be useful, that they didn't have long-range Air Force and airplanes, and really that was not their way of thinking about the war, so they didn't understand what was there for them. But they were really concerned about issues that they didn't like about the American presence on the Soviet territory. And that was the reason why they were so reluctant and why they wanted the Americans out as fast as possible. Eventually, they agreed in the fall of 1944 that there would be a small group just in Poltava. The number of the Americans on the ground would be reduced from 1,200 approximately to 300 people, and those people played a very important role later in arranging the air communications during the Yalta Conference between Europe and Crimea. So why? Why the Soviets actually don't want Americans on their soil? The question is also very important to understand the nature of the Grand Alliance. The Grand Alliance is the alliance which achieved enormous victory and enormous success, but in which the two sides, or two big parts in that alliance, the Western allies and the Eastern allies, are fighting on their own fronts and really never come together until the moment in contact until Germany in the spring of 1945. There was just one of very few places where the Western allies and the Soviets came together and worked together and lived together, and those were the Poltava bases in Ukraine in 1945. That's why it is so important. The episode that involved relatively small number of people, but it is so important for understanding of the Grand Alliance. So back to the question of what was the Soviet concern. Why they didn't want the Americans in. One of them was the issue that of ideology. Of ideology, where the idea was that the Americans who represent capitalism would somehow be a bad influence on the Soviet military, but also on the local population. Another issue was historic, and that was the history of the Russian Revolution, in which the U.S. but also other Western countries were part of the operations in support of the White Army and in support of the enemies of the Bolsheviks. So Molotov, who was the second in command, the Commissar of International Relations, and Stalin later, when he was asked a question about the military bases, he said, okay, it's basically, they can get in, but then it would be almost impossible, very difficult to get them out. So bad memory of the Russian Revolution, the ideology that didn't work and didn't fit, and where the Bolsheviks really considered themselves to be very insecure. Another thing when it comes to insecurity was the way how the Americans were supplied, how well they were provided, dressed, and what image they had and what message they can send to the population that was indoctrinated for years and years and years, that they allegedly lived in if not in the communist paradise, then in the country that was on the way of getting there. So this cultural inferiority was another factor. Because and I will talk about that when you get to the women with whom the Americans were meeting, and then the Soviet secret police interrogating them and collecting information, they would be saying that, okay, that the whatever that meant, that the area was occupied before that by Germany, that Germans were actually cultured and Americans are more cultured than Germans, and of course the Soviets were at the very bottom. So there was all these issues where the country that later became known because of the Iron Curtain first built the Iron Curtain around its borders already in the 1930s in particular, and didn't want outside corrupting influences. So you can think about ideology, you can think about a form of the civic religion that exists at that time in the Soviet Union, but also comes to the fore at the at those bases. So this is a number of photos demonstrating, of course, the stage. There were reporters, there were film crews coming from the United States, coming from the Soviet Union, celebrating the alliance and great achievements. The military impact of what was happening there was minimal for a number of reasons, but one of them was that the Soviets didn't want the Americans. And then the things really went down already in June of 1944, 2 months after the bases were opened, when the Soviets turned out they were not able to actually protect the American airplanes on the ground in Poltava. And that was the German attack was there, Luftwaffe attacked, and the losses were not comparable to Pearl Harbor, but the largest number of the American planes lost on the ground since Pearl Harbor. Again, we are talking there about maybe 10 to 12. It's not Pearl Harbor, but again, the U.S. was not losing that sort of numbers. So how did the Americans approached the Soviets? And again, what we know, what I was trying to do was to take American sources and then compare that to the secret police files and try to come up with a picture. First of all, there was huge excitement among the American soldiers and American pilots who were assigned to those bases. The Soviet Union, by 1943, by 1945, had an image, a very positive image in the United States, and Stalin as well, as the country and the leader that was fighting Germany, fascist Germany, and were doing that very effectively. But there was also another reason why all the Americans, or the absolute majority of them, were so positively predisposed. Well, this is the photo of George Fisher, a prominent sociologist who got his training at Harvard after the Second World War, but he spent interwar years in the Soviet Union. He was a son of a prominent left-leaning journalist, Louis Fisher, and his father parked his family in the Soviet Union when he was traveling the world. So Fisher was on a number of levels a dedicated communist, but he and his family, they left the Soviet Union in 1937 when the purges started, and he had this idea that Stalin betrayed the revolution. Fisher was put in charge of the pre-selecting the people who would be actually going to the Soviet Union, with the idea of trying to remove anyone who could be a potential troublemaker, in a sense that those who had anti-Soviet views. They needed a lot of people who would be who would know Russian language or Slavic languages in general, and most of them were coming, of course, from immigration. So people who were considered to come in from the wide guard anti-Bolshevik immigration, and their children normally would be removed and would not be sent there. Meanwhile, there was a big number of the Americans whose parents immigrated either from the Russian Empire before the revolution of 1917. So had this leftist views, and certainly looked at the Soviet Union in a very positive way, like Fisher looked himself. But That's was not limited to people with a particular ideological background or family history. Generally, overall, the Americans were excited to go and to fight together with the Soviets, and there were very high expectations. As things were not going in the right direction, this is a picture of the American after the American officer after the attack on the base on Poltava and Mirhorod base by Luftwaffe, when the planes were destroyed. Things started to be more difficult in relations between the Soviet and Americans, but it wasn't what was happening in the skies or what was happening on the front lines that really made the Americans start changing their attitude toward the Soviet Union. When I saw the reports and Soviet secret police were reporting this change in the attitudes, my original thought was that, well, probably what was happening was that what the Soviets were concerned about, one group comes from the capitalism, another is socialist, and that there would be an ideological clash. There was maybe a little bit of that, but I didn't find much evidence of that. Not just those who came from the emigre families, left-leaning emigre families in the Soviet Union, were looking sympathetically at the Soviet Union. Most of these people grew through the Great Depression, right? So they were really looking at the Soviet Union and trying to look as positively as possible on a different way how the economy was organized and how it was arranged. So it wasn't what I thought that I would find. Private ownership and how you run that, none of that, almost none of that. But what you see more and more is basically this very negative response to what would emerge as a really police state, as the state without freedoms. And that came to the fore on a number of issues, but none of them was as important as the issue of the dating the local women. Americans were not liked for that anywhere in Europe, right? They had more money, they had resources. The Brits were really concerned about the Americans producing this sort of a competition that they didn't want to have. In France, again, so whatever was the attitude to the U.S. Air Force and Army as a fighting force is one thing. Whatever was the attitude toward the American boys competing for the local girls, it was very different. So from that point of view, the Ukrainian situation was allegedly not different, except on the Soviet side, there was the police state, the intelligence that actually was regulating those relations. And there was a dramatic change from May of 1944 when they were encouraging dating and other things, and then after June 1944, one officer after another reporting that, okay, I was on a date there and there in the park. The two plainclothes men, and one actually was in the officer uniform, Soviet Army uniform, approached us, and actually they were starting to, first of all, call names attacking that girl, and then physically attacking her. So as you expect, there would be fights between the American servicemen and the Soviets who were attacking those dates. The situation was so bad that starting in August of 1944, all the possibility for the American servicemen actually to go for holidays or something, during the weekend into the city were all canceled. The the most dedicated to the idea of alliance American officers, and one of them was William Kaluta, who spoke. He came apparently from Belarus, who spoke Russian, was very excited. Was in the first days. We have the secret police reporting about him saying that, well, I'm here. My father would not believe it. Once the war is over, I want to bring my father, my entire family, to see what is happening there. So it was as pro-Soviet for a number of reasons as one can imagine. He eventually ends up to be in charge of investigation, what was happening with those women. The Soviets changed the tactic around the New Year. So they would allow for the New Year ball the local women to come in, but they would also register all of them. And then they would become targets for recruitment. And again, Kaluta would talk to them. The idea was that there should be not just liaisons of that sort, but there should be no also marriages, and indeed there was no one single marriage, despite the fact that the archives are full of the documentation about Americans wanted to marry local girls, especially those who had family roots somewhere in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe. What we see is that the Americans who were super excited about cooperation and collaboration with the Soviets in 1944 become sworn enemies of the Soviet Union by the time when the last American leaves the Poltava base in June of 1945. I mentioned this William Kaluta. He eventually continues and joins the army. The George Fisher, who was the guy responsible for the recruiting of the officers to the Poltava base, and then became one of the key officers at Poltava, eventually has to leave in April of 1945, almost again before being arrested. Writes later memoirs where he again continues to be true to his leftist ideas, but is very anti-Soviet. And what I found really that the situation on the ground, let's say I'll show just a couple of pictures. That's the first monument that the Americans are shown there in Poltava, monument to Stalin. This local women, dates, dances, Americans marching on the day when they learned about the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But what I found was that the story of many Americans on those bases was not very different in terms of their evolution from what we already know, and other historians did that before me. The evolution of people like Averell Harriman, who was the American ambassador to Moscow, starting with high expectation and being then disillusioned. And Harriman becomes one of the first who really tries to harden the approach of the new president, Harry Truman, immediately after death of FDR. When we look at the officers, American officers at the Poltava base, many of them end up in Berlin and in Germany. And the Soviet officers from Poltava bases also end up in Berlin and in Germany, because both sides, they need the experts. And before the Cold War starts, again, it's a contested issue when exactly it started, but let's say 1948, you see already there's people who have no illusions about continuation of that alliance. And my argument is that it's not about the social system per se, it's not about capitalism and socialism, it's not about geopolitical calculations. They all had the same enemy and had the same goal, but the Soviets would not allow the level of the just personal freedom that the Americans expected, and the Americans never accepted the regime that would spy on them, that would lie to them, and would try to interfere in what they considered to be their private lives. Was it democracy? I believe that those were parts of the democracy, the way how we understand them and how we think about ourselves in democratic societies. Thank you very much for your attention. I probably went over 30 minutes. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But I'm certainly happy to really move to another stage and another mode of our meeting and conversation. So, Kirill, I'm all yours. Where do you want me to sit?
Turn on my mic.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Serhii, for a really wonderful talk. And I wanted to pick up with this experience of encounter between Soviet and American servicemen. As you say, this is a unique moment where the two are side by side. And so it really gives such a rare perspective on the making of the Cold War from below. Not the standard story we know of big officials, but really the men on the ground. And you've talked so much about how American servicemen experienced an evolution. Men like Fisher, Kaluta, how they became disillusioned through their experience with the Soviet system. I wonder if you could speak a bit to the Soviet side of this. Did the Soviets learn anything from this encounter? Did this change how they thought about America and the Cold War? Or are you suggesting that the Soviet attitudes, the suspicion, paranoia, this political culture is already in place and therefore less liable to change?
Thank you. And yeah, this is very important part of the story. What is happening with the Soviets? I have again a lot of information collected by the Smersh, by the counterintelligence on the Soviets as well, and I have also some of their memoirs. And one thing that comes especially from the memoirs written after the fall of the Soviet Union in 91, when the atmosphere was basically democracy was perceived, that was the future for Russia, for the post-Soviet space. So the people were writing quite honestly, and one of them was saying that, well, we absolutely believed that ideologically we are sort of superior to the Americans. We know the truth. We know where it is going. We understand through the class analysis and other things what is happening, and they're really Americans are politically very naive. They couldn't really figure out what was happening in terms of the American discipline within the army. Because in the Red Army, in the Soviet Army, it's whatever happening with the real discipline, but the show is right there. You stand up when you talk to your officer, you show all sorts of respect and subordination is visual and clear. And they couldn't understand that private in the American army could just sit like that in the chair and talk to the lieutenant, and they would call themselves by the first name. And the Soviets would believe that was all for show, that was specifically to create an impression, an image that wasn't there. They were really fascinated with the technological and the B-17 that were there, and generally the technological knowledge of the Americans, but we're trying to show that they're better. They would say that, well, it's unheard of. He didn't finish the job, and there is lunch, and he left for lunch. The Soviet mechanic actually works until the job is done, and they bring some food or something like that, but you never leave the airplane before you fixed it. What sort of the army is this? What sort of a discipline it is? So those cultural differences were there. But generally, I wasn't able to find, like on the American side, a number of people whom I could really follow. There is a couple of cases when the Soviets actually were trying to get on the American airplanes and leave the Soviet Union, including in Italy, and that was a big deal. We also know the secret police collects from the population at large. What do I expect once the Americans showed up? And some of them are having hopes, okay, with the US already here, it's very clear that what was happening in the 1930s will not be repeated, that it will be a more liberal system. Others are saying, well, in 1918, Germans were in Ukraine and there was an independent or semi-independent state, probably after the war, independent state is coming. So there were really this sort of expectations that really were naive. People didn't realize what was there. The women preferred the Americans, and there was basically the issue. Yeah, that they had all sorts of things like soap, for example, right? That it was difficult to get, and so. But the American soldiers themselves explained that, well, we are so popular because we are dressed better, we are clean, and so I see trajectories a number of people like Zorin and others, but unfortunately I don't have good evidence on how things evolved, except that okay, people were trying to escape, but you really can't tell how many of them were trying to do that. You have a repertoire of what were people saying about the Americans, but the secret police documents don't allow you to say, okay, this is 20% or this is 80% or somewhere in between. So we know, I got a general picture, but my sources didn't allow to do what I did with the Americans to follow. For roughly what I'm saying in terms of the evolution, probably true for 80% of the contingent that was there.
Fascinating. So you spoke about several kinds of difference in political culture, and you gave us some examples. One of the ones that really struck me from the book, and again, you should all buy it and read it, are attitudes towards prisoners of war. And that becomes a major point of tension as well between the two sides. Could you spell that out a little bit for us?
Thank you very much. There was one slide there that I wanted to talk about that, and then there were signs coming from the audience cages. So I skipped that. So thank you very much for this question. Yeah, so there are two issues that I focused on, and not because I decided to do that, but because my sources were leading in that direction in terms of this cultural clash. One was about dating, and really there is no such thing as privacy. The Soviet regime is in your bedroom, and believes that it has the right to be there. And another, this cultural clash was over the prisoners of war. And the idea was there that once the Red Army started to move in Eastern Europe, they were liberating the prisoners in the German POW camps. And some of them were Americans. And the Americans were saying, and FDR personally got involved in that and was eventually, he tried to be as diplomatic as possible with Stalin, but he was really upset and let his emotions to be known to Stalin. So what the US was saying, okay, we will actually send our planes, and mostly planes from Poltava bases, to Eastern Poland, to Western Ukraine. We'll pick up those people as soon as possible, and we will take them home. The Soviets actually never allowed to do that. There is a number of chapters in the book describing how the Poltava became the place where all of them, they were trying to bring them, but the Soviets would check the planes, who was there, who was not, interfere with the work of those commissions. And there were two key reasons, at least when it comes to culture. One was that they didn't want the Americans anywhere outside of Poltava. because they believed that they were spying, but also they had this kind of a bad influence on the Soviets in general. They also didn't want Americans to be in Eastern Poland, because the issue after Poltava was they were deciding what to do with Poland. So they didn't want witnesses to see what they were doing there, and generally were concerned about bad influences. Another very important thing is the attitude toward the POWs. In the U.S. culture, the POWs are heroes. In the culture, Soviet culture, the way how we see it, certainly in the World War II, the prisoners of war are traitors. And leaving aside the issues of collecting intelligence and hiding something from the Americans and about the ideological contamination, there was really genuine not understanding on the Soviet side of why you are treating these people who are traitors as their heroes. And then when the Americans are complaining, okay, they were left wandering somewhere and getting on their own from Eastern Poland all the way to the American embassy in Moscow, the Soviets look at them, what do you want? You want to treat your traitors better than we are treating our soldiers. And of course, the soldiers were treated like dirt. So that brings the issue of the value of life, how it existed in the Soviet culture, how it exists today in the Russian culture in the war in Ukraine. So not just of the enemy or of the population, but of your own soldiers. So I really, the book was written before 2022, but now in the light of this information that we get from Ukraine, it's so many things. I see them now in a very different, not in a very different light. This is not true, but I understand them much deeper and also emotionally much better than I understood when I was just working with the archival materials.
Well, let me ask you about that. So, this is a book that is set in the Soviet Union, but more specifically, it's set in Soviet Ukraine. And belatedly, in the past few years, I think a lot of us in the United States have come to realize that Ukraine has its own history. And I wonder if you could situate your story a little bit in Ukrainian history and tell us about what this episode illuminates about Ukraine and about its experience under Soviet rule.
Thank you. It's the bases ended up in Ukraine almost by accident. So there was no plan to have them in Ukraine and not in Russia or in Belarus or somewhere else. They were looking at the areas that were relatively close to the front line, where it was in early 1944, but also would be secure enough. And also the Soviets wanted them to be more or less in the center of this front, so not to betray where they were planning the new offensive. So eventually they agreed on Ukraine, and that was again one of the most troublesome areas for the Soviet Union since the revolution of 1917. So the population was disloyal, right? The largest army, the peasant army in the Russian Revolution, were coming from Ukraine, the Nestor Makhno army, more than 40,000 people. So there was revolts and rebellions. The area went through the Great Famine of 1932-1933. And then on the top of that, the area between 41 and 43 was occupied by Germans. And then on the top of that, there are these Americans that are coming with their own bad influence on the population. So there was the level of mistrust of the locals that I can't say unmatched, because the Russians, Belarusians were not treated much better, but certainly they were much more problematic and much more suspicious population there. And now, after all this, the struggles for Ukrainian independence in 1918, 1919, the famine, the German occupation, now there are Americans, and they were trying to collect as much information on the locals as they were trying to get information on the Red Army contingent, and the idea was to cut any ties preclude any human relations between the local population and the American servicemen. The story of Ukraine that emerges from that particular episode is the story of the population that over the period of time was either in opposition to the regime or were considered to be potentially unreliable. It's also the story of the region in the Soviet Union where the front line goes through it and the regimes change. Because before that, there was, of course, in Ukraine, there were French troops during the revolution, and then the Polish offensive was going all the way into Kyiv. The warlords of Makhno type continued there for a long period of time. And that is the nature of Ukrainian history that is there for a long period of time and manifests itself today. It's a front line. It's a battleground. And it certainly was back in 1944, 1945, and it is even more the battleground today.
Well, there are some passages in here that read very differently today than I think they did when you wrote them in 2019, even though, of course, a Russian invasion was underway then as well. But there's one that I'd like to read that really stood out to me. You write, "With the winds of the new Cold War becoming chillier by the day, we need to look back at how the Grand Alliance played out in those American air bases in Ukraine and learn from the experience of those who did their best to make it work." So I want to ask you two questions about that. First, do you think we are in a new Cold War? Is that the right framework for thinking about the current state of affairs? And secondly, what kinds of lessons can we learn from this history that may be relevant for U.S.-Russia relations today?
Well, we are certainly in the new Cold War. Again, maybe we'll call it somehow differently. It can be Cold War II. It can be some different term. So there is so many echoes coming from the original, from the first Cold War, including as the result of this war, clearly a new division emerging in Europe. The countries that were in between, like Ukraine or Moldova, that gray zone really in Europe disappears to a degree that it didn't exist, almost didn't exist during the original Cold War. We are not talking yet about the Iron Curtain, but clearly those divisions are becoming much more obvious. We also see that the transatlantic alliance came back to life and has a purpose on the level that it didn't have since 1981 or since 1991 at least. So it's not just the echoes of the Cold War. There's a Cold War institutions that are back and they see purpose, and the societies see purpose in them and in the role that they can perform. The war started, again, I could talk about that for a long period of time, and there is a number of ways to explain the war. But one of them was that after the Cold War, Russia tried to establish itself not as one of the poles in bipolar world. They knew that for economic other reasons it's impossible, but one of the poles in multipolar world. And for that, they needed Soviet space, including Ukraine, the second largest post-Soviet republics. What we see today, we don't know how the war will end. But it's difficult for me to imagine that actually Russia really would be able to realize the original vision of establishing stronger control over the political space of the former Soviet Union, economic resources. We see that China is moving into what used to be the Russia's background, and Kazakhstan and so on and so forth. And the potential is really to, with Russia moving closer to China, there is a possibility of replication of the bipolar world of the Cold War era. with China being one of the poles, and we will see whether U.S. will be capable of performing the same role or not. There's, as you know, there are very serious questions in that regard. So that's the parallels that I see. But more important is that this is the most recent period of the global tensions in which also the Russia or the Soviet Union were part of. And in many ways, the story of today, it's a continuation of what was happening during the Cold War. And the potential of the Cold War really growing as the period where the knowledge about those developments is very important, at least on two levels. The first one, to understand the roots of what is happening today, and other one, try to learn from the experiences of Cold War. And one of the perspectives, at least my perspective, changed on the Cold War, because for decades and decades and decades, the key questions were, again, I don't want to oversimplify, especially in the presence of some leading Cold War experts, but many questions were still informed by the questions of the late 40s. How in the world did we mismanage the situation and got from the Grand Alliance to the confrontation? I think that today the most important maybe question about the Cold War is, how did it happen that we got to be either so lucky or so smart and wise that we are still around and that the Cold War didn't end in the nuclear annihilation? So looking at the Cold War as an experience that allows us today to be here and seeing what steps were made and which steps were not made, and there was a fair amount of luck involved as well. Looking at the stories of those bases, I more or less came to the same conclusions that I came to while I was working on the Yalta book, when I was looking at the top guys. Now I looked at the people on the ground, on the ground level. That the alliances really can't last beyond the war and confrontation and immediate danger if they're not based on some basic values, on values that are shared by the members of alliance, and basic elements of democracy is a precondition for that. So that is one of the lessons that I learned. First, looking at Yalta, but also then looking at what that happened for the average guys on the ground, and the FDR wanted it to be a success story. The commanders wanted it to be a success story. Eventually, they leave the Soviet Union being disillusioned, and why? Because they didn't feel that they could really function there in the way that they have been used to. So that brings me back to the importance of democracy in the international relations as a whole. Just last comment on or at least in this segment on the war. The democracy in the current Russo-Ukrainian war is a very big factor in terms of mobilization of Ukrainians in particular, because the war in Ukraine is fought in two languages, in Russian and Ukrainian. The leaders of Ukraine come from different religious and ethnic backgrounds, starting with Zelensky and continuing with the Minister of Defense, who is Crimean Tatar. So what is there is really loyalty to the state that provided certain freedoms. And after 2014 and annexation of the Crimea, Ukrainians learned that this is not something given and granted, that that's a privilege that they have to defend. It's easy to dismiss the arguments about Ukraine being democratic and democracy as something not exactly relevant and focus on geopolitics alone. what I learned from writing this book is that the values matter.
It's a great point to end our conversation and to open it up for questions. We've got some time, so if you have questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring you a microphone, and Serhii will be glad to respond. Please.
Thank you so much for just a very interesting talk. How long did it take you to get the material, and how sure are you of the material?
Well, I'm very sure. I'm very sure. And I didn't work with microfilms. I was working with the actual documents, so I know how they smell. I know how they look. And I was one of the first scholars who got access to that, to the entirety of that material. So in terms of the physical copies, yeah, I'm very sure. In terms of the information inside, right? So what is there? We have the reporting by the mostly by the officers of the Soviet secret police or counterintelligence, which had their own, of course, interests. They wanted to be promoted. It would be absolutely naive to say that people who are their agents or who they forced to cooperate and spy on their American boyfriends, that they're actually very, very honest and are telling everything how it is and how it was. But overall, they're just providing the sort of information that no other country, with basically probably with the exception of East Germany, with the secret police not being so invasive, can provide. The American intelligence services were not interested in those things and couldn't do it. And a lot of them, for me, coming from the region, it rings true. Not everything. And then how you really sort out what goes into the book, what you trust, what you build your argument on, and what is not trustworthy. You compare it with other sources. And in this particular case, the American report. And when you see that it's basically one and the same because the Americans are doing their own investigations. If you find the same people in reports coming from both sides, and then it's the same, or it clicks, or they basically complement each other, then you know, okay, you can trust not just the smell of those documents, but what is in them as well. So how long it took me to get there? I would say basically maybe 3, 4, 5 years. I knew about the documents. I was trying to get there, and they were opening more and more. You know, there was just two volumes of the summary of the operation of the reports of the agents. And finally, and I think the Ukrainian law allowed to do that, and they were reluctant to do that. I got also access to the personal files. Now it's not a big deal, but back then it was personal files of the officers of SMERSH, including this Zorin. That's how I was able to track him to Washington to see what was happening here. Again, I had also information from George Fisher, whom he approached in Washington, and the Fisher's memory was not great, so maybe they didn't meet on this corner, but on the other corner. But other than that it worked well. So once I got there, it's the archive of the former KGB in Ukraine, the largest open KGB archive. And they're absolutely fantastic. They allowed me to use my iPhone just non-stop, so I was just... there were 2 or 3 times that I was flying to Kyiv to work on those, but I was sitting there like those Soviet mechanics, not making breaks for lunch, and yeah, I got as much as I could. Thank you.
Stalinist work discipline. That's the question up front here.
Yeah,
And I think there's a
could you
microphone.
Give us a view of your journey from your hometown to where you are today.
Well, I grew up in the place called Zaporizhia, which is also the site of not the site, 100 kilometers in the area, is the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant now under the Russian occupation. I've been there in late August and in early September. The place under bombardment. It's really emotionally quite a difficult situation. Like my sister lives there, so we communicate. I also think that here, having conversations with you, that I have a unique opportunity to tell the world and the Americans in particular what that country is about and what these people are fighting for. So that's maybe not exactly the answer of the rest is in my CV, how it went and how it got. But in terms, I basically went to very interesting. I went to a school where they were offering English lessons starting at the first grade. Normally at that time it was the fifth grade, and that was they switched to that model in the 50s during the Cold War. So the idea was that the more Soviet young boys and girls as well were supposed to know English, not to read O. Henry necessarily, so in that sense it was very much a Cold War background, and I was following, already started to follow in the 70s the news, so it was very interesting. And my big hero was, now I understand, it was a Soviet propagandist. His name was Valentin Zorin, also the last name Zorin. But he had some wonderful things he was showing America, right? And you could see from his reportages how cities looked and towns looked and so on and so forth. So, and part of my family, after the famine, they left Ukraine and went as far as they could, and they went to Kamchatka, and then there was Pacific. They couldn't go further. And during the Second World War, part of the family were going on this land lease ships to the United States of America and to Canada. So there was also this legend in the family. So I was very much interested in the U.S. and in that sense, my area of expertise was, again, I'm a historian of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, but I'm very much interested in the Cold War, in the international history, and I'm very much interested in the United States. So where I am now somehow correlates with what I was thinking or dreaming about when I was a teenager.
Yes, there's a question over here.
If you ask the commanders on either side, but certainly the American side, or the airmen and on the ground, would they think they made a difference? Did it matter? Did they achieve the objectives they set out for?
There was a couple of successful bombing raids and operations. Was it a decisive factor? No. But it was very important politically, again, in terms of, okay, alliance can work. And then they contributed with Yalta conference with the logistics, right? So that was important. I think if I would ask them that question, probably the answer would be quite humble. The book is called Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front. they called themselves Forgotten Bastards of Ukraine. So the idea was, okay, someone just left them out there, and so they were not at the center of the developments. There were people, it seems to me, American in Iceland or somewhere there, so they called Forgotten Bastards of this and that. So the publisher said that Forgotten Bastards of Ukraine would not work because with Ukraine already going on in Ukraine, people would think about that it's Ukraine. So we replaced Forgotten Bastards of Ukraine with Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, but that was pretty much their attitude. And then they were very proud when they were in other guys, and they told them, you shouldn't be called Forgotten Bastards of Ukraine, you should be called Fighting Bastards of Ukraine. So they were very important on, again, with Yalta, with the POW, American POW crisis, the politically very important at the time of the opening of the Second Front. And they had some impact, but not a huge one.
We have time for one more question. I see a hand coming up there. If you don't mind waiting for the microphone that's coming your way.
What were the expectations on the Soviet side about the future of the Grand Alliance after the war?
The expectations were that there would be 20 years without war that would allow the Soviet Union to rebuild itself, and then the forces of history that will bring socialism and communism will kick in, and eventually, so Europe was, Central and Western Europe was the next target, but everyone wanted a longer peace. And maybe this is one also of the reasons why the Cold War didn't become hot war early on. So Grand Alliance collapsed, but the peace, the global peace, didn't. So yeah, around 1945, the idea was, okay, that they wanted, there was certainly no trust in the capitalists on the Soviet side, but there was a need for the period of rebuilding, regaining strength, and then getting back on the World Revolution page.
That's all the time we have for questions. There is a book signing to follow, but in the meantime, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Serhii Plokhy.
Thank you. Thank you.